They swore the house was empty until the wall began to speak. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Tell me your city in the comments. I read everyone. Your support makes this storytelling journey so rewarding. Let's continue. The village of St. Mary Mead was enjoying one of its brief spells of cheerfulness, the sort that arrived with the first breath of autumn. The church fete had been held on the green that afternoon, stalls bright with bunting, children darting between tables of sponge cakes and preserves, and the air alive with the chiming of the handbell choir. Now, as dusk fell, the villagers were dispersing, baskets full, and voices pleasantly tired. Miss Jane Marple, who had attended only briefly to make her usual modest donation to the church roof fund, sat later that evening in her drawing room, knitting needles clicking gently, while the lamplight glowed against the lace curtains. All seemed still, save for the occasional sound of a cart in the lane or a dog barking in the distance. It was at precisely 9:30 that the calm was broken. From the direction of the vicarage, solid, respectable, and steeped in centuries of Anglican restraint, there came a cry so strange, so unnerving, that those within hearing were at first uncertain whether it belonged to this world at all. It was not a scream, not even a shout of pain, but a voice, low, insistent, and muffled, as though trapped behind stone. Several villagers swore later it came from within the very walls of the vicarage. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been returning from the Women's Institute meeting, dropped her handbag into the hedgerow and stood rooted to the spot, ears straining. Young Tommy Hewitt, cycling past, nearly fell from his bicycle. Even old Mr. Sims, half deaf from years at the forge, halted his steps with a frown. Then came silence. The vicarage loomed, windows dark save for the faintest glow in the study. The night air felt suddenly colder. Within 10 minutes, a small crowd had gathered at the garden gate, buzzing with speculation, when the vicar himself, Reverend Leonard Hawtrey, appeared at the door. His face was pale, his hands unsteady as he raised a lantern. "There is nothing to alarm you," he declared, his voice too quick, too sharp for comfort. "A burst pipe, perhaps. Sounds travel strangely in these old walls. Please, go home at once." But even as he spoke, Mrs. Price Ridley noticed that his collar was undone, his hair mussed, and, though she would not say it aloud until much later, a look of fear flickered in his eyes. Miss Marple, sitting in her neat little parlour, heard the story the next morning over her customary cup of tea poured by young Cherry, her maid. Cherry was breathless, eager, and already repeating the most colourful version of events. "A voice in the walls, they're saying, ma'am. Clear as anything, like a person buried alive. And the vicar all flustered and telling people it was pipes." "Pipes. Don't cry out like that, do they now?" Miss Marple merely folded her knitting into her lap, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. She had, over the years, learned that the most curious of human dramas often announce themselves in the most peculiar of ways. Pipes indeed. Voices in walls had always, in her experience, belonged not to buildings, but to people, and people, sadly, were infinitely more troubling. Morning thickened into the kind of soft pewter day St. Mary Mead specialised in, the lanes smelling faintly of apples and damp hedges, gossip moving faster than any motor car could legally go. Mr. Pottle's shop, with its string bags and tins of custard powder, became a clearinghouse of theories. The vicarage was haunted. A tramp had hidden in the chimneys. Boys had been playing with a wireless set. Mrs. Price Ridley, refreshed by a night's sleep and a purposeful bonnet, stated with authority that the voice had been female and distinctly distressed. Tommy Hewitt swore blind. It sounded like a man whispering through a handkerchief. By 10 o'clock, the village had composed 3 tragedies and a scandal, all mutually incompatible, and was quite prepared to choose among them whichever best suited personal preference or prejudice. Miss Marple made no contribution. She purchased a modest half-pound of tea, remarked on the early appearance of Michaelmas daisies, and stepped out carefully, her stick sounding a companionable tap on the pavement. Cherry walked beside her, a little breathless, full of compassionate excitement. The girl's kindness, Miss Marple thought, prevented her from enjoying a sensation too openly. But kindness did not protect anyone from repeating a story. "They say Mrs. Dyer at the vicarage has not come out all morning, ma'am," Cherry said. "And the Reverend sent away the window cleaner, which is odd, him always particular about the glass. There's been no sign of Mr. Nash either, the curate, you know, since last night's choir practice." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "Mr. Nash is a conscientious young man. I cannot think choir practice would mislay him, unless it were a very irregular hymn." Cherry laughed and then grew solemn. "Do you believe in voices in walls, ma'am?" "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "people sometimes speak from behind something because they are unwilling to be seen. A hedge, a door, a wall, these are all very much alike in principle. And there is, too, the question of what a frightened imagination may supply." At the vicarage gate, Miss Marple paused to admire the dahlias. She had, quite coincidentally, brought a little jar of damson jam for Mrs. Dyer. No one ever objected to jam, and Cherry's polite inquiry at the door brought them the housekeeper herself, her fingers red from scouring and her eyes swollen with sleeplessness. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Dyer said in a whisper, "it was not pipes. I told the Reverend so. Pipes don't sound sorrowful." She looked over her shoulder as if the plaster might lean in to listen. "He's in the study with the churchwardens, and there's a policeman from Much Benham. Said to tell anyone asking, there's no cause for alarm." "No cause for alarm," Miss Marple repeated, as though she were tasting the phrase for the first time and finding it oversalted. She offered the jam, which was accepted with a tremulous smile, and asked in her most incidental manner if Mr. Nash had been seen this morning. Mrs. Dyer shook her head. "Not since he went to the vestry after choir to fetch the ledger. He didn't come back here, and he didn't sleep in his room. His bed's as tight as a drum." "Ah," said Miss Marple, and allowed her gaze to wander. There is a sort of language in the arrangement of household trifles, if one cares to read it. The umbrella stand held 2 sticks, and an umbrella with a broken rib. There were 3 pairs of boots by the mat, all brushed hastily, a sprinkle of pale dust at the edges, not the ordinary brown of the lane, but a thin grey that clung like talc. A faint odour of carbolic hovered beneath the ordinary scents of beeswax and tea, fresh enough to suggest effort made after 9 o'clock last night. She noted, too, a scrap of harsh green thread caught on the iron scrollwork of the inner door, the kind of rayon woven into cheap choir sashes at Christmas. "I hope the Reverend is not put out by last night's disturbance," Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Dyer crossed herself in a furtive, guilty way that did not belong to the Church of England. "It put him out proper. He was white as paper when he came from the study, and he told me the old pantry floor must be scrubbed again at once, though I'd done it Thursday. Said there'd been a spill of lamp oil, but there wasn't any smell of paraffin then. There is now." Before Miss Marple could reply, footsteps approached, and the door opened wider to admit Constable Graves, young, earnest, and inclined to defer to the truly confident. He touched his helmet to Miss Marple, and tried to look as if nothing at all were amiss beyond a minor domestic inconvenience. "Morning, Miss Marple. Reverend says there's to be no bother. Bit of mischief last night. Boys, most likely." His eyes slid away as he said it. "If anyone asks, you may say we've everything well in hand." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "One does so dislike bother. It never improves a situation." She and Cherry took their leave and walked into the lane, where the sunlight made a watery attempt at cheerfulness. After a little distance, Miss Marple paused again, ostensibly to examine a hedgerow spiderweb beaded with moisture. Cherry, who knew her mistress's ways, waited in silence. "Boys," Miss Marple said at last. "Boys are capable of great ingenuity, but when they achieve mischief, they are, on the whole, untidy. Last night's mischief, if mischief it was, has the very particular tidiness of someone who hopes to prevent a question being asked. That, my dear, generally means there is a question to be asked." They turned toward the churchyard, where the yews stood like discreet parishioners at a funeral. On the north side, the vestry door was locked, but scuff marks showed recent traffic, and a crust of the same pale dust lay along the sill. Miss Marple bent with apparent difficulty and peered at the latch, where a faint smear of something oily glistened. The choir notice board, protected under glass, announced Sunday's anthem in Mr. Nash's clear hand. "Abide with me." A corner of the paper had been torn and pinned back, not neatly. Little things were so often eloquent when they had been hurried. "Cherry," she said, "would you be so kind as to fetch Mr. Pottle's string, the stout kind he keeps for parcels? We may very likely need no more than that, and perhaps a quiet word with Mrs. Price Ridley, who hears so much she cannot possibly remember it all accurately. People forget the order of events when they are excited." Cherry brightened. "Shall I say anything in particular?" "No," Miss Marple said. "Merely ask after her poor nerves. While you do so, I shall call upon Mrs. Dyer again and inquire, in the most helpful way, whether lamp oil usually leaves such a very clean patch on stone. When kindness meets secrecy, the truth frequently comes out to be comforted." By late afternoon, the village was vibrating like a plucked string, each person's account of the vicarage incident having grown in confidence, if not in accuracy. Miss Marple, who had spent the better part of her day moving gently between conversations, was not so much listening to words as observing the small inconsistencies in tone and detail that revealed more than the speakers meant to. Mrs. Price Ridley, for example, declared she had distinctly heard a woman's cry, but she also insisted she had been halfway home when it happened, a claim contradicted by Tommy Hewitt, who had seen her standing in the lane at the precise moment. Such lapses, Miss Marple reflected, were not necessarily malicious. People often adjusted their memories to cast themselves in the most credible or sympathetic light. That evening, when Cherry returned from her errand with the parcel string, she reported dutifully that Mrs. Price Ridley had been ever so obliging, though unable to keep her narrative straight for more than a few minutes. The girl, wide-eyed, asked whether Miss Marple truly believed there was a person hidden in the walls of the vicarage. Miss Marple smiled faintly and said that walls were seldom accommodating to people for long stretches of time, though secrets did have a curious habit of seeping through cracks. At twilight, Miss Marple chose to walk toward the vicarage once more. There was no harm, after all, in admiring the churchyard roses, nor in pausing near the vestry door. Constable Graves had stationed himself discreetly by the lich gate, attempting to appear nonchalant while turning away anyone inclined to wander too near. He greeted Miss Marple with a stiff politeness, clearly embarrassed to be standing watch without any plausible explanation. She inquired kindly after his mother's rheumatism, which softened him at once, and he admitted in a low tone that the Reverend was dreadfully particular today, demanding the church remain locked. Miss Marple bent to straighten the strap of her sensible shoe and noted the dusting of pale powder still clinging to the threshold of the vestry. The constable, seeing her gaze, shifted uneasily and said it was just plaster fallen from the old wall. She did not contradict him, but her mind, trained by decades of observation, registered the too clean scrub of the flagstones nearby, where a darker smear still lingered faintly at the edge, missed by a careless brush. As they spoke, the vestry door opened briefly. Out stepped Reverend Hawtrey, his face flushed in the lantern light, his collar once again slightly awry. Behind him, visible only for an instant before the door closed, was the outline of something heavy wrapped in sacking, set awkwardly against the far wall. The Reverend greeted Miss Marple with forced geniality, thanking her for her continued concern, but assuring her that all was utterly prosaic. He excused himself quickly, saying he was late for a committee meeting, though Miss Marple knew very well there was no such meeting scheduled that evening. She returned home with her knitting bag, outwardly unruffled. Inwardly, however, she had begun to fit the puzzle pieces together. The missing curate, Mr. Nash, had been last seen in the vestry. The mysterious cry had seemed to emanate from the walls of the vicarage, though cries, once muffled by stone or fabric, might appear to come from any number of directions. The Reverend's insistence on scrubbing already clean flagstones, and his visible agitation, suggested that something had occurred he desperately wished concealed. Later that night, as Cherry tidied the parlour, Miss Marple sat quietly in her armchair. "Cherry," she said at length, "do you remember when little Daisy Prynne accused her brother of stealing apples, and it turned out she herself had eaten them, though she insisted the voices in the orchard told her otherwise?" Cherry looked puzzled, but nodded. "It is a curious thing," Miss Marple continued, "how people will invent explanations when the truth presses upon them too closely. A cry from the wall, for instance, is really nothing more than a cry from a person, placed where one does not expect them to be." As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and reached for her notebook. She jotted a few names: Reverend Hawtrey, Mrs. Dyer, Mr. Nash. Beneath them, she wrote a single phrase, the floor scrubbed twice. Then, after a pause, she added another line. "What becomes of a curate who never lies down in his bed?" Sleep came late to St. Mary Mead that night, for the villagers could not resist peering from curtains or whispering across garden fences. And at the heart of it all lay the vicarage, solid and silent under the moonlight, its windows dark, its doors closed, and its secrets pressing restlessly against the stone. Miss Marple, calm as ever, waited. She knew the truth, like water, always found its way through the smallest crack. The following morning dawned with a peculiar hush, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The vicarage remained shuttered, its curtains drawn against the daylight, while the usual rhythm of comings and goings was conspicuously absent. Even the milk cart passed by without pausing, a small departure that did not escape the villagers' notice. At Mrs. Bartlett's shop, the hum of conversation was filled less with amusement now, and more with unease. People whispered of Reverend Hawtrey's pallor, of the absent curate, of Mrs. Dyer's strained face when she ventured out to fetch coal. Rumour had shed its playfulness and taken on a sharper edge, the kind that scratches at conscience. Miss Marple, seated as usual at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast spread thinly with marmalade, listened to Cherry's account of the latest tales. Cherry was troubled, her usual brightness subdued by the tension in the air. "They're saying," she reported, lowering her voice, "that the Reverend is keeping someone shut away in the vestry. Someone ill, or worse. And Mrs. Price Ridley swears she saw smoke in the middle of the night coming from the vestry chimney, though no fires ever lit there." Miss Marple buttered her toast with a gentle precision. "Smoke, my dear, is often the product of imagination when paired with a dark window and a nervous mind. But sometimes, too, where there is smoke, there has been a fire of sorts, whether of wood or of human fear." She set down her knife and looked thoughtful. "We must not leap to conclusions, however. Appearances, as I have found, are seldom straightforward. Yet there are always little signs, small things, which betray the larger truth." That afternoon, Miss Marple took it upon herself to pay a call at the vicarage, bearing under her arm a modest posy of asters. She presented them to Mrs. Dyer with kindly apologies for intruding. The housekeeper looked strained, as though she had slept little. Her hands twisted the flower stems nervously as she accepted them, and her lips pressed tight together before she invited Miss Marple into the hall. The air inside was heavy, as though the rooms had been kept too long without proper airing. Miss Marple noted a faint tang of disinfectant, mingling with something less definable, metallic, and unsettling. Her eyes, though mild, observed the umbrellas once more, now rearranged, and the boots missing from their accustomed place. She allowed her gaze to settle for only a moment on a pair of gloves, crumpled and oddly damp, left beside a hymnal on the side table. "The Reverend is in his study," Mrs. Dyer said quickly, "but I fear he cannot be disturbed." "Of course not," Miss Marple murmured. "One understands how very burdensome parish matters can be. I merely wish to inquire after his health and whether poor Mr. Nash has yet returned. Young men do sometimes grow restless, but it would be most unlike him to vanish so abruptly." Mrs. Dyer's hands tightened on the flowers. "He'll be back soon, I'm sure," she said, but her voice faltered, and she cast a nervous glance toward the closed study door. Miss Marple, with the gentle persistence of one who never hurried, engaged the housekeeper in small domestic questions about the laundering of surplices, the best way to remove mildew from hymn books, and gradually Mrs. Dyer's composure began to slip. Her voice grew tremulous, her gaze flickering toward the passage leading to the vestry. She seemed, in her own fashion, to be carrying a weight too great for her shoulders, yet fearful of setting it down. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused by the window. "Your garden is much improved, Mrs. Dyer. I notice you've had the soil turned near the yews. That is no small task." The housekeeper started, her eyes darting to the flower bed as though betrayed by it. Yes, the Reverend said it must be done at once. The roots were lifting the path, he said. Her words tumbled out with unconvincing haste. Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the explanation with apparent innocence. Yet as she stepped into the lane again, her mind worked quietly. The Reverend had never shown such sudden enthusiasm for gardening before. Freshly turned soil, absent boots, a locked vestry, and a voice in the wall. It was all beginning to coalesce into a picture she did not yet wish to draw too plainly. That evening she invited Mrs. Price Ridley to tea. The lady, never one to decline an audience for her theories, arrived bursting with detail. Between sips of Darjeeling and nibbles of seed cake, she expounded on the likelihood of smugglers, of escaped convicts, even of a foreign spy. Miss Marple listened serenely, allowing her guest's imagination to gallop, then steered the conversation with practiced subtlety. "And when you heard the voice," she asked at last, "did it seem nearer the ground or higher, as though above you?" Mrs. Price Ridley frowned, caught off guard. "Why, lower, I think. Yes, quite low, almost as though it came from beneath one's feet, but I cannot be entirely sure." Miss Marple nodded gently, as though the point were of no great consequence. "It is very easy to be mistaken in such matters. Sounds often travel in the most peculiar ways. Still, your recollection may prove most helpful." When her visitor departed, Miss Marple sat long into the evening by her fire, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She considered the weight of silence in the vicarage, the Reverend's strained demeanour, and Mrs. Dyer's trembling hands. She recalled the pale dust near the vestry, the scrubbed flagstones, the missing curate, the freshly turned soil. Piece by piece, the outline of the truth pressed itself upon her mind like a photograph developing in shadow. But she did not hurry. Patience, she knew, was essential. Human weakness, once stretched taut, would always betray itself. The Reverend might attempt to silence the walls, but walls had a way of speaking again when least expected. And so she waited, quietly, with eyes more perceptive than any in St. Mary Mead, for the next crack in the vicarage's careful facade to reveal itself. All that day, the hush over St. Mary Mead felt like the thin film on cooling milk, fragile, ready to break. Miss Marple, who never broke anything if she could help it, moved with the soft, purposeful drift of thistledown. She inquired after chilblains, admired chrysanthemums, and allowed people to talk. When people talk in a strain, the truth, like cream, rises if one is patient. By noon, she had 3 reliable facts and a dozen unreliable speculations. The reliable, Reverend Hawtrey had changed the vestry lock that morning. The boiler room hatch in the church was newly fastened. Mr. Nash's bicycle had not been seen since yesterday afternoon. The unreliable concerned ghosts, smugglers, and a mysterious widow from Plymouth who had never existed. After luncheon, she took a mended surplice to the church, and in her pocket the stout parcel string Cherry had fetched. Constable Graves, dutiful at the lich gate, tried to look as if guarding a locked door were an ordinary form of piety. He carried the bundle. She thanked him and let him. In the nave, the air tasted of stone and old music. Dust lay like pale flour on ledges. The vestry door, with its new brass, sat smug in its frame. At the foot of the jamb, A seam of fine, greyish dust matched what she had noticed at the vicarage threshold. The verger, crossing with a bucket, confided that the Reverend had tidied in there himself. Said he wouldn't have us stirring things, he added, affronted. And he sent for coal, Miss Marple. Coal, when the boiler's not been lit these 5 years. Perhaps it hopes to be remembered kindly, Miss Marple said, and allowed the remark to mean nothing. She went out by the north door and round to the churchyard. The strip of soil near the yews was turned again, lightly, as if a conscience had done it. Spade marks were shallow, more a rearrangement than a labour. A glossy black feather lay caught in the roughness. She lifted it with the tip of her glove and thought of choir sashes dyed too green and of the harsh scrap of thread on the vicarage inner door. Tea with Mrs. Hawtrey offered another sort of silence. The vicar's wife, thin and earnest, poured too much milk and apologised twice. Under gentle questions, she spoke of sleep broken by the sound of something dragged across boards, of her husband's insistence that doors remain locked, of a scent in the passage, like metal or pennies. She tried to laugh and failed. It is nonsense, of course. Floors, Miss Marple said, are terrible gossips when one has taught them a secret. On the way home, Miss Marple met Tommy Hewitt with news of a bicycle in the ditch, the rim bent as if it had kissed stone too ardently. Constable Graves, fetched, pronounced it likely Mr. Nash's, which any child could tell from the patched saddle and the bell that stuck. The chain was newly oiled. Pale dust clung in the crevices. By evening, the village called the find proof of flight, proof of robbery, and proof of murder, in that order. Miss Marple set none of these firmly in her mind. She sat with her knitting as the light faded. At 9 o'clock, the hour of the first disturbance, she laid her needles down and opened her window a little. Then, from the church, a sound arrived upon the air, thinner than before, as if words had been reduced to their essence. Not a cry now, nor even a moan, but a careful exhalation that might, to the imaginative, be pain, to the experienced, fear. Stones in the lane seemed to carry it underfoot. Miss Marple stood still, tracing the sound as one traces a draught to a door. Shawl wrapped, stick in hand, she went along the hedge to the churchyard gate. The vestry door gleamed faintly with new brass. She did not rattle it. She stooped where the sill met the path and drew from her pocket the parcel string. With the quiet assurance of one darning a heel, she slid the end beneath the door, fed it along with a hairpin, and brought it up at the hinge where a nail-head stood a fraction proud. She tied a small loop and let the strand lie slack, no more than a spider's thread across her. When she had done, she tapped once with her stick on the stone. The quiet inside changed, the way a sleeping room alters when a dream stirs. A whisper of breath answered. No words, only the ache that words would have been. "Mr. Nash," Miss Marple said conversationally, "if you are there, have courage. People do foolish, frightened things in the dark. In the morning, light makes better suggestions." Nothing more came for the moment. But as she stepped back, she heard, not from the door, but slightly to the left, the faintest wooden creak. Boards under stone complain in their own language. Miss Marple permitted herself the smallest, saddest smile. Not triumph, never that. She had heard at last, where the wall had found its voice. At dawn, a colourless mist lay over the churchyard, the yews beaded with dew like morning lace. Miss Marple was early, ostensibly to collect rose hips for jelly, a small basket on her arm, and a quiet determination in her step. The parcel string lay as she had left it, untouched. The vestry door had not been opened in the night. She knelt, as if to tie a shoe, drew the slack away, and pocketed it neatly. Across the grass, the north wall, crouched, and at its foot, the boiler hatch showed a new padlock, attempting the shabby dignity of age. A smear where a key had bitten paint, not yet hardened, betrayed haste. Constable Graves arrived with a yawn and an apology about the fog. He accepted a peppermint. Gratitude is a solvent for suspicion, He admitted the Reverend had ordered the boiler room left alone and said a repairman was expected. "Repairs are so tiresome," Miss Marple observed. "They often begin where nothing was broken." She asked for permission to dust the memorial brasses before Sunday. Graves agreed, provided the vestry stayed locked. Inside the nave she polished slowly, letting the rhythm tame the impatience beating in her breast. In pauses she heard, or believed she did, a faint, hitching breath through the wall to the left of the vestry, where last night a board had murmured. She crossed to the side aisle and examined the flagging. One stone was newer, its mortar tidier, a shy rectangle in a field of comfortable wear. She laid her glove upon it and felt the memory of sound, like a heartbeat in plaster. When she emerged, Reverend Hawtrey stood by the lich gate, colour too bright for the hour. He thanked her for keeping the village calm and spoke warmly of Christian forbearance. Miss Marple murmured approval and asked, without emphasis, whether he had heard from Mr. Nash. The question lifted like a bird and settled. His eyes followed it and then fled. Mr. Nash, he said carefully, had gone on a retreat and left a note. "Ah," said Miss Marple, "silence is restorative. Yet retreats are usually announced, otherwise they resemble flight." A flush pricked his throat above the collar. "People will take things amiss," he protested. "All the more reason to set them right quickly," she replied. Almost idly, she added that coal merchants were unreliable and hoped his sack would arrive before the day warmed. He seized the foolishness like a drowning man a hat, muttered about tariffs, and excused himself. By late morning, a repairman appeared, or rather a man with a tool bag and a city coat too good for crawling under boilers. He introduced himself uncertainly to Graves. Miss Marple asked what office had sent him. His answers proved watery. She inquired, as if it were a riddle, what size spanner he preferred for an antique Beddington valve. He did not know. A true workman would say so cleanly. Graves stiffened, and the stranger decided to be late somewhere else. He departed in a flurry of apologies and polished shoes. "Do keep a closer watch," Miss Marple suggested gently, "and if the Reverend requests solitude, give him company instead." Afternoon drew a thin, strained sunshine. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Dyer with a bundle of clean towels and found the housekeeper pale but steadier. In a voice that pretended it was about linens, Mrs. Dyer confessed that the Reverend had taken to kneeling long at the study wall and that she had heard a tapping, patient and small, as if from the other side. She thought it. "Mice," she said, "but mice do not pause when you say the Lord's Prayer." "You are a good woman," Miss Marple told her. "Good women sometimes wait too long. If you hear anything again, fetch me at once." At dusk, Miss Marple returned to the church with Cherry, ostensibly to lay flowers. She placed Cherry by the porch with simple instructions. If anyone came from the vicarage side, walk toward them singing the Nunc Dimittis and drop your handkerchief. Inside, Miss Marple stood by the left-hand wall and after a long soft silence, tapped 3 slow beats with her stick. The air answered with a shallow, broken echo and then a strained exhalation that was certainly human. "Courage," she said gently, and felt rather than heard the sob that followed. She knelt and pressed her palm to the cool stone. "We will open what was wrongly closed." Before she rose, she slipped the parcel string through a narrow crack at the skirting and tied a small loop, this time not to catch but to guide. The line vanished into darkness with the faintest tug, as though a hand, tremulous and obedient, had taken hold. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the stone, "there will be daylight and witnesses." Then she gathered Cherry and walked home under a sky the colour of pewter, counting, as one counts stitches, the few remaining steps between secrecy and speech. Sleep would come lightly, for truth was already turning in its uneasy bed before the dawn. The next morning came, with the kind of brittle light that seemed to make every sound sharper, every glance more significant. The village woke under its routine chatter, but beneath the surface there was a current of unease, as though all of St. Mary Mead had been drafted into a conspiracy it did not quite understand. At the baker's counter, hushed voices speculated about the curate's bicycle, while at the post office it was said the Reverend had looked not himself at all when he walked briskly past with his hat pulled low. Miss Marple moved serenely through these ripples, her knitting bag hanging lightly on her arm, her eyes taking in what the tongue alone never confessed. She noted, for instance, that Mrs. Dyer failed to appear at her usual errands, and that when the vicarage curtains finally opened, they were opened only halfway, as though to peer without being seen. Such small silences, Miss Marple had always thought, shouted loudest of all. By mid-morning she walked to the church again, Cherry at her side, ostensibly to check the flower arrangements. The constable at the lich gate looked uneasy, his youth betrayed by a habit of biting his lip when confronted by a question he could not answer. Miss Marple asked whether the Reverend had spoken of Mr. Nash's whereabouts. Graves admitted reluctantly that the Reverend insisted the curate was on retreat, though no one could produce the letter he was said to have left. It is the smallest things, Miss Marple reminded herself, that often collapse the largest explanations. Inside the nave, the air was damp with stone and old wood polish. She paused before the vestry door, noting that the keyhole showed faint scratches, as though someone inside had tried the lock from within. Her hand lingered lightly over the brass handle, but she did not touch it, only let the weight of her glance rest there before moving on. She bent at a pew, rearranging flowers, but her eyes were on the wall, listening as much as watching. There it was again, scarcely more than the shift of breath against stone, but distinct, a sound not belonging to emptiness. When she returned outside, the Reverend himself stood at the path, his face set in a grim mask of composure. He greeted her warmly, but his voice was too loud, his smile too eager. He spoke of a new initiative for church repairs, of the need for discretion lest rumours undermine good work. Miss Marple replied with her usual mildness, noting that gossip, like ivy, often flourished where stone was already cracked. For just a second, his eyes faltered, a flicker of weariness and fear breaking through the practiced mask. He bid her a curt farewell and strode off toward the vicarage, his gait a fraction too hurried for dignity. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bartlett, who had always prided herself on knowing the comings and goings of every lane. Over tea and currant buns, Mrs. Bartlett let slip that on the night of the mysterious voice she had seen the Reverend carrying something heavy across the yard, something slung over his shoulder, bulky and limp. She had thought it a sack of coal, but reflected now that the shape had not been right at all. Miss Marple listened with patient attentiveness, her eyes serene, though the picture in her mind grew clearer with every word. Later, when dusk fell, she walked once more past the church, pausing by the north wall where the soil had been turned. The damp earth held the faint outline of a boot, smaller than the Reverend's and lighter in tread. The curate's, perhaps. And there, caught against a clump of roots, lay the string she had threaded the night before, drawn taut as though pulled from within. She bent slowly, picked it up, and coiled it into her palm, her expression one of mild domestic concern rather than discovery. Back at her cottage, she said little to Cherry, only remarked that the chrysanthemums were lasting remarkably well for the season. But when she sat in her chair with her knitting, she let the needles fall idle in her lap. The Reverend had spun a tale of absence, but the walls of the vestry had begun to betray him. A man may close doors and padlock hatches, but human weakness is a restless tenant. Sooner or later, it must speak. Miss Marple folded her hands together, her eyes distant and thoughtful. She had no need to hurry. The truth, like the faint thread she had tied through the crack, had already been taken hold of from the other side. Now she need only wait until daylight and human nature conspired to tug it fully into view. The following. Day brought with it a restless sort of brightness, as though the sun itself disapproved of being asked to shine upon concealed things. The village, though outwardly moving in its customary rhythm of errands and deliveries, felt charged with the nervous watchfulness that comes when something unsaid is pressing against every threshold. At the post office, two women whispered together, pausing mid-sentence whenever the door opened, while Mr. Pottle, usually cheerful, served his customers with absent-minded severity, his eyes always straying toward the church lane. The Reverend had not been seen since early morning, and Mrs. Dyer, venturing out only briefly for provisions, kept her head bent and her lips pressed tight, as though silence were the only protection she could still offer. Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that silence is itself a form of speech, took a gentle walk toward the churchyard in the mid-afternoon. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, supposedly hymn book covers for repair, though the package was quite empty. Such props were useful. They let others explain away her presence without difficulty. Constable Graves was again at his post, shifting from one foot to the other with the discomfort of a man who knows he is being asked to watch without being told precisely what for. She stopped to speak with him, as though the errand were casual, and drew him into talk about his mother's garden and the early frost. While he rambled, she let her eyes travel along the church wall, noting that the patch of freshly turned soil seemed darker today, as if moisture had been drawn from below. A faint indentation broke the neatness of the surface, as though the ground had settled slightly since yesterday. Inside the nave the air was still and thick, the silence broken only by the tick of the great clock overhead. Miss Marple lingered by the vestry door, bending to retrieve a fallen petal, her eyes alighting once more on the faint scratches round the keyhole. Her gloved finger brushed against them, and she thought how often desperation announced itself in such small scars, the mute testimony of someone who had tried and failed to escape. She straightened slowly, listening. The silence pressed back, but she fancied she heard, behind the stubborn hush, the faintest throb of breath. She murmured something about drafts to graves and moved on, but in her mind the sound lingered. By evening, the rumours in the village had grown darker. Mrs. Price Ridley claimed with absolute certainty that a woman's hand had been seen at the vestry window, though there was no such window low enough to permit such a sighting. Tommy Hewitt insisted he had heard tapping again when he cycled past at dusk. More practical voices suggested that Mr. Nash had run off in disgrace, but none could explain why the Reverend should grow so pale, nor why Mrs. Dyer seemed close to collapse whenever the subject was raised. Miss Marple invited Cherry to sit with her. After supper, offering the girl a slice of seed cake and speaking in her usual mild tones. "People often tell the truth," she said, "but they rarely do it directly. They let it slip in fragments, or dress it up as something else, and one must have the patience to untangle the thread. Do you recall the string we left, my dear?" Cherry nodded eagerly, her eyes wide. Miss Marple leaned closer. "It was drawn from within. That tells us two things. Someone is indeed enclosed, and someone else is determined that they remain so." Cherry shivered, though the room was warm. "Do you mean Mr. Nash, ma'am?" "It would be rash to assert it without proof," Miss Marple replied. "But I believe we shall not wait long for proof to present itself. Those who are desperate to keep a secret often overreach themselves, and in the overreaching lies discovery." That night, St. Mary Mead lay under a hush deeper than usual, the kind of silence that magnifies every creak and sigh of timber. Miss Marple, wakeful in her chair, heard the distant toll of the church clock. At the half-hour past midnight, she slipped a shawl over her shoulders and stepped quietly into the lane. The moonlight silvered the stones, and in its glow she saw movement near the church wall. A figure bent low, labouring with a spade. The soil at the yews was being turned yet again, and the man, though he wore his hat pulled low, was unmistakably the Reverend. His movements were strained, frantic, as though he were fighting the very earth itself to bury what it refused to accept. Miss Marple remained quite still, her small frame half concealed by the hedgerow. She watched until he paused, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. Then he bent again, and the spade struck with a hollow sound that did not belong to soil. He froze, his body rigid, then hastily covered the spot once more, shoveling with a violence that betrayed terror more than effort. When at last he staggered upright and glanced about him, Miss Marple had already withdrawn into shadow, her presence unseen. She returned to her cottage silently, her thoughts ordered with the calm clarity of long practice. She had seen enough and heard enough to know where the truth lay. But she also knew that the truth must not be forced too soon, lest it crumble under its own weight. Human nature, she reflected, was rather like that patch of disturbed earth, pressed down too hard, and the hollowness beneath only showed itself more plainly. Tomorrow, when the village once again gathered in whispers, she would be ready to let the cracks widen just enough for daylight to pour in. Morning set its face to duty, and so did Miss Marple. At the post office she remarked, as one mentions the weather, that the churchwarden's key stuck in the vestry lock. By the green, the remark had become a project. The verger fetched a pry-bar. Mr. Pottle brought a lantern. Constable Graves decided his oversight belonged indoors. Cherry came because kindness might be useful. The knave met them with cool breath. Miss Marple let their footsteps settle, then turned her head toward the left wall as one turns to a child expected to speak. Silence held. She nodded. "Mr. Graves," she said, "perhaps the boiler hatch should be inspected." Graves hesitated, then signalled to the verger. Metal rasped, the new padlock yielded. The hatch complained open, stale air crept out with the smell of damp stone and carbolic. "The lantern, if you please." They lowered the light. A narrow crawl ran along the foundation. "Mind your head," the verger muttered, already on his knees. Graves followed. Miss Marple stayed above, listening. The ear often arrives where the foot cannot. From within came the shuffle of cloth on wood, and then the sound no building makes. A stifled cough, trying not to be borne. "Steady," Graves called. "Who's there?" a voice answered, hoarse, more breath than word. "Nash." Cherry gripped Miss Marple's sleeve, but Miss Marple only exhaled. "Go carefully," she said. "He may be bound." There was a clatter, a curse bitten short, and then the juddering progress of two men backing out of a hole with a third between them. The curate's face, when it met the light, was the colour of paper handled too much. A rag had cut a line across his mouth. His wrists bore the polite bruises of rope. He blinked, flinched from the lantern, and then, seeing Miss Marple, managed a ghost of apology. "I'm so very sorry," he whispered. "I sang out." "No," Miss Marple said. "When people are put away like winter clothes, they wish to be brought out again." She undid the rag and helped Cherry hold water to his lips. "Can you bear to speak? A little will do." Before he could answer, footsteps rang in the porch. Reverend Hawtrey came down the aisle at a pace too rapid for dignity. His gaze fell on the open hatch, the lantern, the pale young man on the stones. For a heartbeat his face was empty. Then he clothed it in outrage. "What is the meaning of this? Who authorized—" "I did," Graves said. "Safety inspection." "Safety!" The Reverend's laugh struck the air like a stick on ice. "You endanger the parish. Close that hatch at once." "No," Miss Marple said very mildly. "It is best we keep it open a little longer. There is always a reason why a man hides another in a wall. Sometimes it is wicked. Sometimes only foolishness dressed as righteousness." The Reverend's mouth opened, then shut. His eyes fell to Mr. Nash, who had begun to tremble, not with fear, Miss Marple thought, but with the shock of being let back into a world that had continued without him. Mr. Nash wet his lips. "It was an accident," he said, as if repeating a lesson. "There was an argument, and he did not mean—" "Enough," the Reverend said hoarsely. His hands were shaking. "Go home, all of you. There is nothing here that concerns you." "That," Miss Marple observed, "is an odd way to describe the curate of the parish." She spoke to Graves without looking away from Hawtrey. Fetch Dr. Haydock, and perhaps Mrs. Hawtrey would be good enough to come. At the name, the Reverend flinched. He pressed his fingers to his eyes. When he dropped them, his face was older. "My wife has nothing to do with this," he said, and then ruinously, "She was not herself." Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Hawtrey heard a struggle, she said. She sought to part it. There was blood, and because she is dutiful beyond her strength, she tried to wash it away. The Reverend stared at her, and from his stare the fight went out. He sank onto a pew. "He came to accuse me," he said dully. "The accounts, the roof fund. I meant to put it right. My wife stepped between us when I pushed him. He struck his head. He wasn't dead. His voice failed. "I hadn't the courage for scandal. I told myself I was saving her." Mr. Nash turned his head, wincing. "I never meant to ruin you," he whispered, "only to force a reckoning." Miss Marple's look was very gentle. "Reckonings come whether we summon them or not," she said. "It is their nature." She rose and addressed Graves. "Keep watch. No one is to be heroic now, not even the Reverend." Outside, bells began to practice a hopeful chord for Sunday. Within, the lantern burned with patient light. Miss Marple folded her hands and waited for daylight to make plain what could be made plain, and to show, as daylight will, the shadows one must still interpret with care. Dr. Haydock arrived with his bag and his usual impatience for foolishness. Under his brisk hands Mr. Nash steadied, colour returning like tea through muslin. The curate's voice was hoarse but sound. He drank, coughed, and managed a tired smile for Cherry. Constable Graves, restored to purpose, set the verger at the porch and sent a boy to Much Benham for Sergeant Marsh. The Reverend sat hunched on a pew end, head in his hands, a man already exhausted by the truth he had tried to outrun. Mrs. Hawtrey came, pale as candle wax, and brave with it. At sight of the curate, she pressed her hand to her mouth, then to her heart. "Thank God," she said softly, and sank beside her husband without touching him. He did not look up. Miss Marple had Mr. Nash seated in a chair and wrapped him in a rug that smelt faintly of lavender. "Tell us what can be told without injuring you," she said. "The rest will keep." Mr. Nash shut his eyes, listening to memory as to a distant bell. "I went to the vestry after choir," he said. "The ledger, there were sums that would not add, and I meant to press the point. The Reverend was angry. I was too. There was a shove. I struck the corner of the oak chest. I woke to darkness, rope, and the smell of stone. I called out. After a long time someone came. Water, bread, a whisper to be quiet for the Reverend's sake. The voice said I was safe and must be patient." "Whose voice?" Graves asked. Mr. Nash glanced toward the aisle, where a figure stood half-shadowed. Mrs. Dyer stepped forward, twisting her raw hands in her apron. "Mine," she said, as if welcoming punishment. "I put him there. I begged God to let me carry the sin." A ripple moved through the nave. The Reverend lifted his head, shock breaking through misery. "Mrs. Dyer!" She bobbed a clumsy curtsy to Miss Marple, miserably humble. He fell, as the Reverend says, and bled something awful. The mistress near fainted. The Reverend was for fetching help and facing it. But she swallowed. I thought of scandal, and her poor nerves, and the bishop, and how people talk. I said I would make it tidy. I knew the crawl by the boiler from repairing pipes, and I believed the Lord would pardon secrecy that saved his church. I fed the poor lad. I told him to pray. When he rattled the lock, I begged him to be still. Miss Marple's voice was kind but exact. You changed the vestry lock, scrubbed the stone twice, and turned the soil to hide the ledger and whatever else the Reverend could not bear to see. You meant to keep him only until you had a story that would carry, and then, perhaps, to send him away by night. Mrs. Dyer's tears came, with relief more than shame. Yes, miss, I took the key. I meant no harm. I could not think how to end it once begun. Miss Marple's eyes rested for a moment on the Reverend. And you dug by moonlight because you wished to bury the book that accused you, if not of malice, then of weakness. You did not free the curate because every hour made courage harder. That is often so. He covered his face. I told myself I was protecting my wife. Mrs. Hawtrey's voice, tremulous yet steady, came from the pew. You were protecting yourself, Leonard. I would have stood beside you in daylight. In darkness we make cowards of ourselves. A small silence followed, respectful of pain. Miss Marple broke it almost apologetically. There is one matter more. Mrs. Dyer, last night the string I slipped beneath the skirting was taken from within. You passed it to Mr. Nash, who tugged. Later I found it taut at the yew-bed. You fetched it out again, hoping to remove the trail. The housekeeper nodded, defeated. I thought if I took it away there'd be no proof. Proof, Miss Marple said gently, is a chorus, a green choir thread caught on the vicarage door, a newly oiled chain on a bicycle that never reached a bed, a padlock too new to be true. Your good intentions stitched everything together, and the voice in the wall was never stone, but charity misplaced. Sergeant Marsh arrived then, square and grave, and took statements with a care that made no fuss of anyone's dignity. He spoke of inquiries, of magistrates, of the necessity of unpleasantness when pleasantness has done its worst. He promised the curate a hospital bed for observation, and the Reverend a formal interview later that day. Dr. Haydock, all brusque kindness, said there would be bruising and nightmares, but no lasting harm if peace were allowed to do its work. When they were gone, the church felt larger, emptied of secrecy. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Hawtrey while Cherry brewed tea in the schoolroom. You will do very well, she said, patting the woman's hand. You have truth, and that is serviceable in any weather. What will become of us? Mrs. Hawtrey asked, not weeping. Something better than last night, Miss Marple replied, and something worse than yesterday. That is the way of reckoning. She rose, and before leaving, laid her palm once more upon the stubborn wall. It had held its voice as long as it could. Having spoken, it was mercifully still. The following Sunday dawned with a stillness that seemed to honour the gravity of what had passed. The bells rang as they always did, but their notes seemed softer, more chastened, as though the very air carried the weight of secrets uncovered. Villagers filed into the church, their eyes full of curiosity and unease, but order was kept, for in small communities, propriety stands even when certainty collapses. The Reverend, absent from his pulpit, was already in the hands of the law, and Mrs. Hawtrey sat among the parishioners with composure that was both fragile and brave. Mrs. Dyer, red-eyed and subdued, had chosen a rear pew, her hands folded tightly, as if holding herself together by sheer force of will. Mr. Nash, pale but upright, entered under Dr. Haydock's watchful eye, supported discreetly by Constable Graves. A murmur passed through the congregation, half relief, half astonishment, that the curate was alive, that he had been hidden so close all along, seemed both miraculous and deeply unsettling. People whispered of providence, of shame, of the strange persistence of truth that even walls could not silence. Miss Marple, in her accustomed place near the back, listened not to the sermon, delivered this time by a substitute from Much Benham, but to the cadence of the whispers, the slight shift in tone, the relief edging out the scandal. She knew well enough how memory would alter matters, how in weeks to come the story would bend to fit the comfort of each teller. Yet she also knew that some impressions would remain unshaken. The echo of that first cry, the stillness of the vestry, the sight of a man's frailty revealed behind his role. Later, as the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple found herself approached in turn by Mrs. Price Ridley, Mr. Pottle, and young Tommy Hewitt, each eager to assure her that they had suspected from the very beginning that something untoward lay behind the locked doors. She accepted their claims with gentle nods, her eyes twinkling with the mild amusement of one who knew precisely how human nature arranged its recollections. Back at her cottage, Cherry brought in the tea and could not keep from asking, "Ma'am, do you think the Reverend was truly wicked?" Miss Marple considered, stirring her cup slowly. "Wickedness, my dear, is often no more than cowardice carried to its end. Reverend Hawtrey feared disgrace, and in shielding himself he endangered others. Mrs. Dyer feared scandal, and in her misplaced loyalty she prolonged suffering. It is seldom grand villainy that brings sorrow, but small failings, pressed upon by circumstance, until they grow too large to contain." Cherry frowned thoughtfully, then asked, "And Mr. Nash? Will he recover?" "With care, yes," Miss Marple said. "He has youth, and the knowledge that he was right to press for truth, though truth came at a fearful cost. He will walk more gravely, but also more wisely. That is what adversity does when it spares us." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles moving steadily. The village would settle again. The flowers would be arranged, the ledgers balanced, the gossip polished into anecdote. Yet beneath it all, the memory of the voice in the wall would linger, a reminder that even in the quietest places, secrets pressed against their confines, waiting for someone to listen. She reflected, not without sadness, that human beings so often made prisons for themselves out of fear and pride, when a confession, spoken in time, might have been a key. But she did not dwell over long. Instead, she tied off her wool neatly, folded the work into her basket, and allowed herself the smallest smile. The affairs of St. Mary Mead were once again aligned with daylight, and though shadows would always gather, she knew well enough how to read them. For Jane Marple, truth was never buried long. It merely waited, patient as ever, for a listening ear.